Exiting the presentation and logging back in usually fixes it. For those of you who have never attended a Click Meeting event, there's a chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, but you can ask your questions in the chat box, or if you have any urgent issues that you need to say, feel free to type them in the chat box and I'll respond. And again, we'll get started here in just a minute. All right, we will go ahead and get started then, I think. Welcome to this week's installment of Florida Talks at Home. My name is Alex Buell, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator for Florida Humanities. Normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programming like this in person, but obviously that can't happen right now. Our goal is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin convening people again in person. Next week, we'll have Dr. Magdalena Lamar discussing cultural significance of female superheroes in society. It'll be on June 24th at 6 p.m. You can register for this event on our Facebook page or on our website, floridahumanities.org. At the end of tonight's presentation, we have a very short survey. Before signing off, we'd greatly appreciate it if you took a moment to fill it out. If you have any questions for the speaker, please type them in the chat field in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Arlo Haskell was born and raised in the Florida Keys and is an award-winning writer, historian, literary organizer, and publisher. Much of his work focuses on the literary and social histories of Key West. He is the author of The Jews of Key West, Smugglers, Cigar Makers, and Revolutionaries, 1823 to 1969, which received a Florida Book Award Gold Medal for Florida Nonfiction. He is also the executive director of the Key West Literary Seminar and has written a number of poetry collections, including Full Proof and The Joker. And with that, I will turn it over to Arlo.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for, I guess, logging in this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the first virtual talk I've given, so I would just imagine that I'm looking at all your faces out there, and I appreciate you you coming to hear me talk tonight. Before I get started, I want to dedicate tonight's talk to Robert D. Richardson, a great American historian and friend of mine who passed away yesterday. Bob Richardson was the author of biographies of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Henry James. He was a neighbor of mine in Key West and just an inspiration, somebody I really looked up to and whose work I admired and whose research practice I learned a great deal from. As Alex mentioned, my book won the Florida Book Award, but for me, the proudest I ever was of my book was when, Bob told me not only that he liked it, but that he couldn't put it down. So anyway, this talk tonight is for my friend Bob. This image you see on the screen, this is Key West, Florida in 1884, a couple of years before Key West was largely destroyed by fire. If you can see my cursor, this whole kind of lower third of the map was wiped out by a fire in 1886. And an early version of the talk I'll give tonight was actually called "Where There's Smoke, There's Fire." And this has to do with cigar smoke and with gunfire, but it also has to do metaphorically with the research instincts that have been an important tool as I worked on this project over the course of several years. That larger project is a history of the Jewish community in Key West. Bits and pieces of this history have been handed down over the past 100 years or more and have generally been accepted as the truth. I tried to look at each of them as something more like a clue, as the lingering manifestation, like smoke, that still hangs in the air long after the chaos of the fire has been put out. Key West is a town almost obsessed with its history. And for good reason. Few places can boast of Key West's colorful past. For better or for worse, that history is also a part of its economy. I say for better because entrepreneurs in Key West have largely come to realize that history is good for business, that tourists will pay top dollar for an experience that they feel is authentic and historically accurate. I say for worse because most business owners are not historians. The marketing people they hire to write scripts and website copy are not historians either. Mostly they just want to tell a good story. And the result is that the history of Key West, like so many tourist places that have a kind of well-known popular history, it often comes to seem like a game of telephone, one that changes with every telling. So for my book, I tried to poke through the myths, the marketing pitches, and the family stories to get back to the primary sources: newspaper accounts, memoirs by people who are actually there, photographs, business records, and government documents. Of course, I had to make a lot of guesses along the way too, as I followed the smoke of evidence back to the fire of action. And so I too, like the worst of them, have introduced interpretation and hypothesis into the historical record. That is what makes history fun, what makes it seem like life. If you know just a little bit about Key West's history, you probably know that it was a major center for the production of cigars during the late 19th century. But the fact that Jewish manufacturers had a major role in this industry has been almost entirely forgotten. And this forgetting is not without reason. The political activism of Cuban laborers on behalf of the wars for Cuban independence during the late 1800s make the Key West cigar industry an important part of Cuban heritage. And the history of this industry is in part, or is part, of the birth of the Cuban nation and the Cuban identity. But the pioneer of the cigar industry in Key West was not a Cuban, but a German-born Jewish industrialist named Samuel Seidenberg. You see an early newspaper advertisement for Seidenberg's factory here on the screen now. Prior to Seidenberg's arrival in 1867, cigar making in Key West consisted of only a few small shops that produced just enough cigars for the local market. When Seidenberg constructed this massive factory, La Rosa Española, which employed more than 500 people, he revolutionized the industry. Seidenberg accomplished what other manufacturers had dreamed of, but had lacked either the nerve or the financial capital to execute. By establishing a manufacturing base not on the Spanish-held island of Cuba, but at the American outpost of Key West, Seidenberg took advantage of tariff laws that favored domestic production. The United States was technically at peace with the Spanish Empire, but it was waging a sort of economic war in the hopes of weakening Spanish influence. This tariff structure was part of that aggressive effort, which would eventually destroy much of Spanish Cuba's manufacturing base. So with Cuba only a day's sail from Key West, Seidenberg maintained virtually the same access to Cuban leaf tobacco as the factories there. The same warm, humid conditions that were conducive to cigar rolling prevailed in both locations. And as the armed insurrection that began in eastern Cuba grew into the 10 Years' War of 1868 to 1878, Seidenberg found a ready workforce of skilled Cuban tobacco workers who had sought safety from the war in Key West. La Rosa Española was soon producing cigars at 2/3 the cost of his competitors, and Seidenberg was becoming one of the wealthiest tobacco magnates in the United States. So there's another Seidenberg image. I had a great deal of fun finding all these old newspapers with different cigar ads. So that's just an alternate version of the Seidenberg one. Within 10 years of opening that factory, Seidenberg had recouped his initial investment and amassed a capital of $400,000, which would be about $9 million in today's money. And he had taken on a new partner, a fellow German Jew named Samuel Wolf, whose advertisement you see here. And in 1878, in really an extraordinarily bold move, the two men made a deal to purchase the entire year's output of Cuban tobacco before harvest time. Unfortunately, the crop turned out to be a poor one, and Seidenberg and Wolf suffered a significant loss. The following year, they doubled down, negotiating in advance a discounted price for, once again, the entire Cuban tobacco harvest. But this yield also failed to meet expectations, and the temerity that had brought Seidenberg such success now delivered his ruin. With debts totaling $500,000, Seidenberg was forced to lay off nearly 800 employees. Overnight, the largest manufacturer of cigars in the country had gone bankrupt. So Seidenberg's failure, which made news in the New York Times and all over the country, dramatized just how great of a success he had made. He had shown the world the great potential of cigar manufacturing in Key West, and his bankruptcy now created a major opening for other manufacturers who would seek to replicate that early success. Among the wealthy industrialists who immediately followed Seidenberg and filled the vacuum that his collapse had left were Jewish men like Julius Ellinger, Max Marx, and David and Pincus Pohalski. This image now is a photograph of the Max Marx factory in the early 1880s. This was, if you know Key West, this was on Green Street, relatively near the harbor there. And this next image is a photo of Pincus Pohalski. Pincus Pohalski hailed from Bryansk, territory near Ukraine at the eastern edge of the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement. In 1881, he came to Key West with his brother David, where they operated at first a small factory on Simonton Street. They soon acquired a larger facility and expanded their workforce from 20 employees to about 100. Then the factory grew again in 1885. And in 1886, Pohalski and Company acquired a large plot of land on what was then the outskirts of town, where they began construction on yet another new factory. This new Pohalski plot covered most of an entire city block in Key West. And when the massive Montecristo Factory opened in July of 1888, it was hailed as the largest factory on the island, with 3.5 stories, 12,000 square feet of factory floor space, and nearly 500 employees. All around the factory building itself, which you see in this image on screen now, this is an artist's representation of the building in about 1888. And all around that factory was a town that had been kind of constructed along the model of northern industrialists. There were about 300 residents that lived in this so-called suburb, which had its own dry goods and grocery stores, its own restaurants, a drugstore, and a saloon. The factory, of course, was the hub of all this activity, producing 250,000 cigars each week. And to celebrate their new factory, the Pohalskis had commissioned a reprint of Alexander Dumas' classic tale of adventure, intrigue, and revenge, The Count of Monte Cristo, which was given away as a promotional item to customers of their cigars. You see the frontispiece of this book that they published on screen here. This was one of the great finds in our local public library to come across, this great piece of literature used as a promotional cigar advertisement. I was really thrilled when I came across that. So a visitor who went to the Pohalski factory in 1891 wrote about a distinctive institution that was common to many cigar factories during this time. You will be surprised upon entering, this observer wrote, to see a man standing erect in the center of the room, book in hand, reading aloud. You cannot help but notice, although Spanish may be Greek to you, that the reader's voice is powerful and well-trained, reaching to the extreme corners and to the most distant ears on the vast floor. He is a professional reader. So lectors, as these professional readers were called, had emerged as a feature of cigar factory life in Cuba during the 1860s, and this tradition had migrated to Key West. These daily readings were really like the public radio of their time, drawing from popular entertainments like Dumas' novel, The Count of Montecristo, which the factory had been named for, as well as news items from Cuba and from the international Cuban exile community. Now, a lectur's choice in reading material tended to reflect the issue of greatest concerns to his audience. He wanted to be popular and to be hired to continue to read at the factory. And in the Jewish-owned factories of Key West, where the Cuban laborers included many veterans of the 10 Years' War, the central and most important issue was always the cause of Cuban independence. So I'm going to circle back to the lector tradition and cigars in a couple of minutes. But first I wanted to kind of zoom out and discuss what was happening in the larger global Jewish community at this time. Nearly 200,000 Jews had left Europe for the United States during the 1880s. And by the end of that decade, considerable numbers had made their way to Key West. Many were from Romania and the various territories controlled by the Russian Empire, which had expanded to include all of Poland, as well as the Baltic states, traditionally known as Lithuania and Latvia. Smaller numbers of Jews were from Austria and other parts of Europe. And they had come of age during an era when Jews in Europe experienced increasing political marginalization, violence, and persecution. A time when governments were pursuing a demented vision of racial purity and homogeneity. Key West, on the other hand, in the years following the Civil War, had emerged as a bilingual and racially progressive city that was a haven for political exiles. From 1880 to 1890, the population of the town had nearly doubled, driven largely by Cuban exiles who had fled Spanish oppression. Spanish was almost as widely spoken as English. Newspapers were written in Spanish, as were the signs to stores. Cubans were a dominant force in local politics, with Cubans even representing Key West in the state legislature in Tallahassee. The city had even elected a Cuban as its mayor. Key West was also the command center of Cuba's Revolutionary Army, a service in which Black and white Cubans, as well as men of other nationalities, served equally. And the ethos of racial equality that characterized the Cuban independence movement permeated Key West, where in 1888, a Black man named Charles DuPont was elected sheriff of Monroe County, and another Black man, James Dean, was elected county judge. You can't imagine two more different places with different values than Key West and Romania during the 1890s. The sympathies that developed between members of the Cuban and Jewish communities in Key West were rooted in existential similarities. Jews had not simply undergone recent persecution in Eastern Europe, but they had endured systemic anti-Semitism and oppression that had kept them as a group on the run for centuries. Ever since Moses led his band of stateless wanderers through the desert, the Jewish experience and tradition has been defined partly by exile. Cuba, at this time, was one of the last outposts of the Spanish Empire, the same empire that had persecuted Jews throughout the Inquisition, violently driving Jews from Spain and Portugal into the territories of Eastern Europe. Native-born Cubans on the island of Cuba, like Jews in Russia or Romania, were denied fundamental rights that were afforded to Spanish citizens. White Cubans could not own property and had no say in government. Black and mixed-race Cubans were property owned by the ruling Spanish class and confined to the tobacco plantations where they worked as slaves. So the growth of the Cuban independence movement was inextricably linked to a booming American cigar industry in which Jewish industrialists now played a major role. By 1888, Jewish firms were responsible for 70% of the entire US market for raw tobacco. 45 of the 65 members of the National Cigar Manufacturers Association that year were Jewish. Tens of thousands of Cuban exiles were employed in cigar factories in the major exile centers of Key West, Tampa, and New York, and their wages largely funded the Cuban struggle. And this brings me back to the lector tradition and to the factory of a German Jew named Julius Ellinger. So at Ellinger's factory, the lector who read the day's news to cigar rollers was perhaps the most influential Cuban resident of the city. It was a man named José Dolores Pollo. Pollo was the publisher of El Yara, which was a local Spanish language daily that openly advocated overthrow of the Spanish government on the island of Cuba. Pollo was a regular correspondent with José Martí, and like today's television pundits, Pollo used his appearances as a lector to act as a mouthpiece for Martí and to pursue their shared goal of revolution. This brings us to José Martí. It's a photograph of Martí in Kingston, Jamaica, in the late 1880s, 1888, I think. José Martí was really an extraordinary figure who is still, kind of poorly understood in the United States, or his impact is poorly comprehended, I think. If, as an American, if you can imagine Walt Whitman, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln rolled into one person, then you have some idea of the significance of José Martí in Cuba. He was a poet, journalist, a statesman, a really singular historical figure. He was an ardent defender of human rights and one of the foremost democratic theorists of his time. No man has any special rights because he belongs to one race or another, Martí exclaimed in 1890 with intoxicating certainty. And going even further, there are no races, he said. Martí was one of the great observers of the massive wave of American immigration that was taking place during the late 19th century. And his reportage from this period displays a particular sensitivity to the Jewish plight. These are grave times for the Jews, Martí wrote in 1882. They have been expelled from Russia and are chased through the countryside like wild animals. Martí, in fact, had been a scholar of Jewish history while he was a university student, and also had a basic understanding of Hebrew. Martí was deeply inspired by the integrity and endurance of Jewish culture, which had survived throughout the ages, despite all obstacles. From their religion, the Jews make their homeland, Martí wrote in 1881. They still feel that ardor which led their ancestors to seek shelter under the banner of Mattathias and to spread out like the angry sea over plains and mountains. José Martí was also a master politician, and he may have addressed Jewish concerns partly in order to curry favor with the Jewish tobacco magnates whose tacit support he required in order to effectively communicate and fundraise among his base, the Cuban tobacco workers. In any case, it's very clear from his writings that Martí had an intuitive, even a visceral understanding of the existential struggle of the Jews, and that he identified the historical challenges facing the Jewish people with those that confronted his own community of exiles. In one battle cry to his fellow Cubans, Martí carried this line of thinking to its logical conclusion. We are Jews in point of fortune, Marti explained, a Cuban speaking to other Cubans. And we hope always for a Messiah who never comes. There is only one way to see the Messiah come, and that is to sculpt him with your own hands. This brings us to Louis Fine, who you see here in his, Fine was a Mason, and this is his Masonic formal wear, actually. I love this photo. It makes him look very warrior-like, of course, which is what he was. So Louis Fine was among the leaders of the group of Jews who were active supporters of the Revolutionary Party of Cuba. Born in 1866, Fine hailed from a small town near the important Jewish city of Vilna, once known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Fine's grandfather had been a rabbi, and his father was a respected Jewish scholar as well. The Lithuania of Fine's formative years was known as the center of advanced rabbinical scholarship in Europe, and Fine's fellow Lithuanian Jews had a distinctive reputation as free thinkers, as people who routinely questioned and challenged authority. Although he himself was not an ordained rabbi, Fine was a singular figure in Key West Jewish religious community and quickly became its acknowledged leader. Louis Fine was the founder of the first synagogue in Key West, which was also the first synagogue in South Florida. It began with services led in the family home in the late 1880s, early 1890s when he came to Key West, and then the formal synagogue the land was acquired and the property was modified for the community shortly after the turn of the century. This next image, this is a map of the city of Key West. Consider it an aerial view of sorts. This is by the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, which is really one of the great, the Sanborn fire maps are one of the great resources for really kind of close-grained historical research in Key West and in lots of other towns around the country. They give you this real block-by-block, house-by-house description of who lived where and what was happening in the city. And a lot of my research kind of looks at a Sanborn map, for example, and kind of, in a sense, overlays it with the census records of that same time to look at the map and the physical layout of the town, and then go through the census records to figure out, okay, which person lived in which house, who was neighbors with whom, and then following that like initial web of connections to try to figure out what the life of that community was like and what else may have been happening there. So this is the neighborhood where Fine lived. It was known as El Barrio Gato. It was home to hundreds of the cigar maker, the Cuban cigar maker, Hernando Gato. So it was home to hundreds of his Cuban employees, as well as powerful Cuban exiles who were closely involved in plotting the revolution. Louis Fine's neighbors in this block included the Cuban financier Cayetano Soria, the esteemed military generals Fernando Figueredo and Serafin Sanchez, and José Martí's confidant Teodoro Perez. Martí himself often stayed in a home in this neighborhood right next door to Louis Fine when he would visit Key West. In fact, this next image is a house where Martí would stay. That was next door to Fine's house, and Fine had a house, and on a little lot adjacent to it, he had a kosher meat market, and Martí would stay adjacent to that. So eventually, José Martí was invited to address the Jewish community directly. He spoke eloquently, as he always did. He acknowledged the historic struggle of the Jews and the recent persecutions that had forced the men in his audience to flee halfway across the globe from their homes, where many still had relatives for whom anti-Semitic terror remained a fact of daily life. So for this important speech to the Jews of Key West, Martí drew upon his extensive knowledge of Jewish history and culture. He spoke of the struggles of his own people and of the despotism and cruelty of the Spanish, who had oppressed Jews and Cubans alike. With all and for the good of all had been Marti's rallying cry. And now he pleaded with the Jews of Key West to support the cause of liberty, not simply for Cubans, but for all people. The argument that Cuban liberty deserved the shared sacrifice of Jews was driven home by this man whom you see on screen. He was a Polish-Jewish veteran of the Cuban Revolutionary Forces named Carlos Roloff Mielowski. He'd been born in Warsaw in 1842, raised in Kaliningrad, then Prussian-occupied port city on the Baltic Sea. And Mielowski had taken up the cause of Cuban independence as a young man. He had actually served he fought for the Union in the Civil War. He was kind of a wandering soldier of fortune. He fought in the Union Army and then took up the cause of Cuban independence, ultimately earning the rank of general during the Cuban 10 Years' War. Mielowski met informally with Jews in Key West at the home of General Serafin Sanchez, and he helped establish connections between the military leadership of the revolution and the local Jewish community. So during his landmark visit to Key West in 1892, Mielowski delivered a speech in Spanish, offering his own life history as an example to the mixed race and multinational crowd. Compatriots, he began, I am the son of unfortunate Poland. I am Polish, and my country is a prisoner of three terrible tyrannies: the Russian tyranny, the Austrian tyranny, and the Prussian tyranny. I long for its liberty and cry for its misfortunes. Destiny has been adverse to us Poles, but because I cannot offer my life for the country of my birth, I put all of my efforts for the freedom of that other land where I have lived among heroic men, that land for which I have spilled my blood defending the rights of its sons. And there's a little quirk of Cuban vernacular language in Key West that gives Mielowski's speech a little bit of an added impact. In Key West at the time, within the Spanish-speaking community, Jews were known as Polacos, Polacks or Poles. They were, there were not that. It was assumed that if you were Jewish, you were Polish. So Polacco became the sort of stand-in for Jew. So when Mielowski says, "I am Polish, soy Polacco," he is also confessing that he is a Jew, that he is Jewish, and is sort of establishing this identification with the local community. Lots of the Jews who were in Key West, there was a large Romanian Jewish population, and the Romanian language is very similar to Spanish. So Romanian Jewish speakers could pick up on Spanish very easily and usually became fluent rather quickly. And then there was just a lot of bilingualism at the time. As I had mentioned early on, there were, most stores had signs in both languages. There were newspapers in both languages. So bilingualism was quite common, and Jews coming to Key West would often learn Spanish, even before they had learned English in some cases. So shortly after Mielowski's speech, the revolutionary newspaper, let's see if I can blow this one up a little bit. The revolutionary newspaper published by José Martí called Patria announced the establishment of Club Abravanel, which was a 50-member Jewish cell of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, operating in Key West, of course. Their inspiration was Don Isaac Abravanel, a 15th century financier and statesman who had protected Portuguese Jews from the atrocities of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, since the early 1880s, Marti had used the example of the Jews to draw the attention of his Cuban audience to the bitterness of exile. Now, as final preparations for the war were beginning in 1894, Marti once again drew upon the imagery of Jewish exile to exhort his countrymen to take up arms and fight for their freedom. "We will be brave or we will wander," Marti said. "We will finally put our efforts to the test or we will be outcasts, roaming the world from one country to another. The very ones we love shall bite us in the heart like rabid dogs." "We have no country," Marti wrote in a passage that might as well have been addressed to the Jews, "but the one we must fight for." Now, with the armed phase of the Cuban Revolution officially underway in January of 1895, Jewish partisans evolved from a role in which they had at first provided indirect financial support to one of direct involvement in the acquisition, storage, and distribution of weapons intended for warring rebels on the front line. This photograph you're seeing now, I believe, represents a meeting between the leaders of Club Abravanel and the leaders of the Jewish community. It's a photograph that I found that had no identifying information on it, but based on other photographs that are identified, I've been able to identify several Jewish leaders on the right-hand side and some leading Marti confidants on the left-hand side. So it seems to me likely this is some kind of meeting of the Cuban leadership and the Jewish revolutionary leadership in Key West. So we'll probably never know the stories of the smuggling missions that succeeded. Any good smuggler gets away with it, and you never hear about it, especially not 100 years later. But accounts of those missions that failed provide us with a general outline of the sort of activities that Key West's Jewish rebels were involved in. Louis Wolfson was a Russian dry goods merchant on Whitehead Street, the same Wolfson as the Wolfsonian Museum in Miami is that family. And he was said to have been involved in arms smuggling missions that were carried out by a ship known as the Three Friends. One of these plots in 1896 involved the participation of a Cuban revolutionary, a guy named Marcos Rodriguez, who likely also collaborated with Louis Fine. And their plot on the Three Friends, which was intercepted, involved an attempt to transfer a cargo of weaponry from one ship to another. When they were caught, they were carrying 6 Hotchkiss guns, which were these big rolling cannons that were big, they were rolling, but they were light enough to be used in the mountains of Cuba. They could carry them on horseback up the mountainside. So 6 of these kind of mounted rolling cannons, as well as rifles, revolvers, machetes, and a large quantity of dynamite. So gun running ships like that one, the Three Friends, depended upon a network of secret storerooms and warehouses near the coast where caches of guns, ammunition, and dynamite could be held without arousing suspicion. Louis Fine himself maintained one of these weapons storage depots in the rooms behind his grocery store on Duval Street. The more I learned about Louis Fine, the more I liked him. The rabbi, the gun runner, the weapons storage depot operator. Another plot involved the schooner Competitor, which left Key West for Cuba under cover of darkness one night in April of 1896. That boat carried 48 men, many cases of rifles, dynamite, and some 40,000 cartridges of ammunition. The Competitor was finally overtaken near the Cuban coast by a Spanish gunboat, whose forces killed 3 men and captured several others. And among those captured by the Spanish was the ship's captain, an American citizen named Alfredo Laborde. And throughout his ordeal, Captain Laborde stuck to an unlikely story. He said he had left Key West peacefully for Lemon City. He said he had been hijacked by Cuban revolutionaries and that he had been forced by the hijackers to take on this load of weapons and sail with it to Cuba. Whenever they asked him Laborde said that the ship was owned by a man named Joseph Wells, who was a sponger in Key West. But the vessel was officially registered in Key West to someone else, a man named Pindar. And many years later, Joseph Fine would reveal that the competitor had in fact been owned by his father, Louis Fine, that it had been purchased with Fine's own money, and that Captain Laborde had been working for Fine. Furthermore, the younger Fine said that his father had purchased a second ship, also named the competitor, and that this ship had successfully and apparently without detection inflicted significant damage upon Spanish forces over a series of military excursions. I'll go back to this image. This is Fine. I hope you can see my cursor on the screen. This guy I'm circling right there is Louis Fine. I think Fine is in this image too, taken some years later. This is Fine again here. So clandestine activities like these continued as the war to defeat Spain and Cuba absorbed the attentions of many in Key West's Jewish community. In the early months of 1898, the struggle took on international significance. The American armored cruiser, the USS Maine, exploded and sank in Havana Harbor, killing more than 200 of its crew. The USS Maine disaster received unprecedented coverage by American newspapers, many of whose reporters were stationed in Key West. Even those who had remained neutral up until this point were now confronted with the immediacy of the battle, as Key West became ground zero for a media campaign that eventually pushed the McKinley administration into a formal declaration of war on Spain. This marked the beginning of what Americans know as the Spanish-American War, an involvement that would allow the Cuban rebels to declare victory in their war for Cuban independence by the end of the year. In praise of Louis Fine and his Jewish comrades in Club Abravanel, a general in the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces by the name of Fernando Figueredo said, quote, "They placed Cuba before their own community, and therefore they did so much more than Cubans." Louis Fine, for his part, when asked why he had supported the revolution, he explained that he was, quote, "driven by Jewish vengeance against Spain, the old persecutor of the race." And that's it for my prepared talk this evening. I would love to take questions. I think you can chat the questions in, and I can see them, and I'll try to do my best to to restate the questions, and we'll keep going here. So thank you all for coming here tonight. Give me a second to have a glass of water.
Just put up the survey questions. So if you don't have any questions and you want to go about your business tonight, if you would, before you do that, take a minute to fill out the survey. We'd really appreciate it. And Arlo and I will hang out for as long as needed to complete any Q&A. Someone had asked what the role of the Jews in Key West during the Civil War, I assume. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, during the Civil War, the Jewish community was pretty small, and I've only found very fleeting reference to it. But those references that I found have been pretty exciting and have kind of shined a little bit of a different light on Key West or on certain occasions there. There was a guy by the name of Max White, who was a Polish Jew, came to Key West before the Civil War. He was a tailor. He came with his uncle, and they opened a tailor shop downtown, and eventually got the contract to supply the local military, which was the Union in Key West, not the Confederacy, to supply the Union with military uniforms. And the great thing about Max White is he was a writer. He wrote years later what he called a diary. It's really more like a memoir because it was written many years after the fact. But it's a very detailed account of his early life, including his years in Key West. And in the run up to the Civil War, the Union forces had intercepted 3 ships with African people from the west coast of Africa who were being taken to Cuba to be sold as slaves. And the United States military had intercepted these ships, brought them to Key West, didn't really know what to do with them. Slavery had been outlawed, but there was no real policy yet for what to do with intercepted Africans. So they were held at this military encampment, and Max White provides a firsthand account of what was going on there, because he went in there to provide clothing, in fact, to the refugees that were there. And it's the only firsthand account I know that's not from a military person. It gives a much greater sense of the humanity of the refugees than do the military accounts. He describes them sitting around, eating. He hears them singing a song together, and you get this kind of greater sense of their humanity through his account than you do from any others. So that's the sort of most interesting discovery I made during that period. There were probably, in fact, he says, what does he say? He says, Israelites then and there were far and few, or something like that. There was the community, to call it that, it was probably 10 or 11 Jews in Key West at the time he was there. And then it really started to grow in the period that I'm talking about, in like late 1880s is when the community really took off.
So someone asked if you can comment on the politics of Cuba turning away the SS St. Louis in 1939.
Yeah, so the St. Louis was a ship with Jewish refugees, leaving Nazi Germany, that was turned away in Cuba, and was essentially wandering at sea for some time, trying to seek safe portage in Cuba. They were turned away in Cuba. They were turned away in the United States, but they remained anchored offshore, outside the reef, close to Key West. In fact, Jewish families at the time living in Key West were aware that the ship was living out there, and some people, recall seeing the ship, having gone out in boats to see it at a distance. It was, this was a period when very strict quotas were in place that were, designed to bar Jews from coming into the United States. So the United States did not let them in either. The boat eventually was, worked its way back to Europe, and a large number of those passengers were, I think 50% of the passengers on the boat were eventually killed in the Holocaust.
Someone asked, do any of the factory buildings still exist?
From this era that I'm talking about tonight, no. The oldest one that exists still is, well, actually, I talked about Gatto a little bit, and that neighborhood where Louis Fine lived. So there is a Gatto building, and it is a Gatto cigar factory. It's not all of the buildings then were wood framed, and they didn't last terribly long. But then there was a replacement factory that was made of block that must have been built in the early 1900s, and that building still survives. It's been restored. It's offices for the county, actually, and it's quite a beautiful building, and just kind of a marvel of restoration. So that one still exists. Others do not. I grew up in Key West, and doing a lot of research, especially into photographs for this project, it's wild to now have a kind of a very layered sense of the streetscape and the architecture of this town. I can go to a corner and know that, oh, this is where the Montecristo Factory used to be. It's not there now, but I can kind of see it in my mind's eye. But yeah, the other ones are no longer surviving. Of course, there are lots of buildings from that time. I mean, Key West architecturally is pretty wonderfully preserved, and there are lots of 19th century homes that have survived, but none of those larger factory buildings.
Someone asked if the Key West cigar industry ended after the Spanish-American War, or did it continue even on after Cuban independence?
It continued for a little while. It kind of collapsed around 1910. Not particularly because of anything related to Cuba. In fact, a lot of the industry moved out of Key West and up to Tampa. There were a lot of labor disputes. There were back-to-back really bad hurricane seasons, 1909 and 1910, and that was kind of the finishing blow for an industry that was already kind of starting to struggle in Key West. Then you had a couple of the big factories were really wiped out by that hurricane, and as is often the case, it was kind of a confluence of events that pushed the industry elsewhere.
All right, that's all the questions I see. If anyone has any other questions, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I guess I might as well put in a plug for my book. Normally I'd be talking in person, and you could come up and buy my book, and I could sign copies. But the website is jewsofkeywest.com, and the book is for sale there. If you buy a copy of the book, you can buy it direct from me, from Sandpaper Press, on that website. And if you put a note on there, I can sign the book and send it out to you as well. So would love to have your support for that as well. I'll send you the link there in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. We're still figuring out, the book buying part of these presentations. Usually we have a lot of authors and whatnot who like to sell their book, and that's
sure.
obviously not possible in this format. So
yeah. Well, it's great to see all the comments coming in. I really appreciate everybody, sharing your experience. I'm enjoying reading through these right now, and thanks for your interest and thanks for your time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Arlo. And unless there are any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and call it a night. Again, thank you for everyone tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Tune in next Wednesday to hear about female superheroes in modern pop culture. A little bit of a turn from tonight's talk. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.